What if the Great Flood was not divine punishment, but a targeted military operation, a termination order for beings who knew too much? Tonight, we investigate the 7 sages, the Apkallu, teachers who emerged from the sea to upgrade humanity before history began. You have seen their images in every major museum, eagle-headed figures holding pine cones and buckets. History books call them genies. They were not genies, they were genetic hybrids, the original Watchers. And they were systematically hunted to extinction. The gods did not flood the earth because humanity was wicked. They flooded the earth because humanity was learning too fast. Someone was teaching us things we were never meant to know. Mathematics, writing, astronomy, the codes that run civilization. When the waters receded, the sages were gone, banished to the deep. Their hybrid children drowned, their knowledge fragmented. This is the story of the first information war, the battle between those who wanted to enlighten and those who wanted control. We will trace them from the temples of Sumer to the Book of Enoch, from Babylonian priests to symbols hiding in plain sight. The pine cone in their hand connects ancient Mesopotamia to the Vatican. The bucket they carry may hold secrets about our DNA. Tonight we ask, who were the 7 sages? Why were they erased? And are they truly gone, or waiting in the deep to return? This is the erased bloodline, why the gods hunted the 7 sages. Let us descend into the mystery together. To understand the 7 sages, we must first understand where they came from. The Sumerians spoke of a realm called the Abzu, a vast underground freshwater ocean that existed beneath the earth. This was not metaphor to them, but geographic reality. The Abzu was the domain of Enki, the god of wisdom, magic, and civilization. It was from this watery realm that the sages emerged, rising to the surface to begin their mission among early humanity. The boundary between myth and memory blurs when we examine these accounts, for the Sumerians wrote of these events as history, not legend. The first and greatest of the sages was called Oannes by the Greeks, though the Sumerians knew him as Uana or Adapa. Around 3000 BCE, the Babylonian priest Berosus compiled ancient records into a history that described this being's arrival. According to Berosus, Oannes emerged from the Persian Gulf in the region of Babylonia. He appeared at dawn and taught humanity throughout the day, then returned to the sea at nightfall. He did this repeatedly, delivering instruction that would transform scattered tribes into the foundations of civilization. The physical description Berosus provides is extraordinary and specific. He writes that the whole body of the creature was like that of a fish, and it had, under a fish's head, another head, and also feet below similar to those of a man, subjoined to the fish's tail. The voice, too, and language was articulate and human. This description has puzzled scholars for centuries. Was Berosus describing a being wearing some kind of suit or apparatus? Was this a submarine vessel misinterpreted by ancient observers? Or was this a genuine hybrid creature, a chimera that combined aquatic and human features? The sages did not come to rule over humanity. This distinction matters greatly. They came to serve, to teach, to elevate. The texts are explicit about what they transmitted: mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, architecture, writing, law, and medicine. Every foundational technology of civilization traces back to their instruction according to Sumerian records. They were, in effect, civilizing agents sent from a more advanced realm to accelerate human development. The question that haunts this narrative is why? Why would beings of such capability devote themselves to teaching primitive humans? The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest historical documents we possess, divides history into two epochs, before the flood and after. The antediluvian period, those ages before the waters came, lasted hundreds of thousands of years according to the texts. During this time, the 7 sages operated freely, each one appearing during the reign of a specific antediluvian king. They formed a lineage of instruction, each sage building upon what the previous had taught. By the time the 7th appeared, humanity had received the complete download of civilizational knowledge. Enki, lord of the Abzu, was the patron and perhaps the creator of these beings. He was the god most sympathetic to humanity among the Mesopotamian pantheon, where his brother Enlil saw humans as noisy servants whose population needed culling. Enki saw potential worth cultivating. The sages were his instruments of cultivation, his field agents, inserting upgrades into the human operating system. This created tension within the divine hierarchy that would eventually erupt into catastrophic action. The sages were Enki's project, and Enlil viewed them with growing suspicion. The iconography of the Apkallu is remarkably consistent across thousands of years and hundreds of miles of ancient Near Eastern territory. They appear on cylinder seals, palace reliefs, temple decorations, and amulets. The most common depiction shows them in one of 3 forms: as fish-cloaked humans, as winged humanoid figures, or as eagle-headed beings with human bodies. In almost every depiction, they carry the same 2 objects: a pine cone-shaped item in one hand and a bucket or situla in the other. These objects were clearly of great significance. The Assyrian palace reliefs provide our most detailed images of the Apkallu. King Ashur-Nasir-Pal II decorated his palace at Nimrud with massive stone panels showing these figures standing beside the king. They are muscular, powerful beings, their wings spread wide, their eagle heads gazing with intense focus. They perform ritual actions with their pine cones and buckets, apparently blessing or maintaining something essential. For over a century, scholars dismiss these as decorative genies or protective spirits. But the textual evidence suggests something far more significant. 7 sages for 7 antediluvian kings. The number 7 appears throughout this tradition with suspicious frequency. 7 planets visible to the naked eye. 7 days in the week. 7 notes in the musical scale. 7 chakras in the yogic tradition. The Mesopotamians organized their cosmos around this number, and the sages embodied it. Whether this reflects astronomical observation, biological reality, or something else entirely remains debated. But the 7-fold pattern was not accidental. It encoded something fundamental about how these beings understood reality. The temples where the sages were venerated served as repositories of their teaching. The House of Wisdom in Babylon, the libraries of Nineveh, the ziggurats that rose from every major city. All of these were monuments to knowledge the sages had transmitted. Priests who served in these temples considered themselves inheritors of the sage tradition, keepers of secrets that most people were not permitted to access. The knowledge was not simply academic. It was considered dangerous if misapplied, powerful if properly understood, and sacred in ways that transcended ordinary religious observance. What the sages taught was not merely information, but transformation. The texts suggest that their instruction changed those who received it at a fundamental level. Kings who worked with the Apkallu were said to possess wisdom beyond ordinary mortals, to see further and understand more deeply. This was not simply education as we understand it. Something was being transmitted that altered the recipients. Whether we interpret this as metaphor for profound learning or as something more literal involving actual biological or cognitive modification, remains one of the central mysteries of this tradition. The era of direct sage instruction ended with the flood. Whatever these beings were, wherever they truly came from, their open presence among humanity was terminated by the deluge. The texts are clear that something changed fundamentally when the waters receded. The pure sages no longer walked among humans. The direct transmission ceased. What followed was an age of diminished capacity, of scholars copying texts they no longer fully understood, of priests performing rituals whose original meaning had been lost. The Golden Age had ended, and we have been living in its aftermath ever since. The seven sages were not all identical in their nature. The Mesopotamian texts distinguish between different categories of Apkallu, and this distinction reveals something crucial about the trajectory of their presence on Earth. Initially, the sages were described as pure beings of the Abzu, creatures wholly originating from that primordial realm. They were not human and did not possess human ancestry. But over the long millennia of the antediluvian age, this began to change. The protocol shifted from pure instruction to something more intimate and more threatening to the divine order. The transition appears in the lists that enumerate the sages. The first three are consistently described as beings of divine or Abzu origin, with no human ancestry. They came, they taught, they departed. But by the time we reach the later sages, the descriptions change. The texts begin to speak of sages who were of human descent, beings who combined Apkallu nature with human lineage. This was not simply metaphor for cultural transmission. The language specifically indicates biological mixing, the breaching of a species barrier that was apparently meant to remain intact. This pattern finds remarkable parallel in the Hebrew tradition. The book of Genesis, chapter 6, describes how the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and took them wives of all which they chose. This union produced the Nephilim, the giants, the heroes of old, men of renown. The book of Enoch expands this account dramatically, naming the angels who descended and describing in detail what they taught humanity: metallurgy, cosmetics, astronomy, and the interpretation of signs. These Watchers, as Enoch calls them, map directly onto the later Apkallu. The connection between Apkallu and Watchers is not merely thematic but structural. Both traditions describe supernatural beings who descend to Earth during the antediluvian period. Both engage in forbidden mixing with human women. Both transmit advanced knowledge that transforms human capability. Both are punished for their transgressions, bound or banished as consequence of their actions. The Hebrew tradition appears to be drawing on Mesopotamian sources, reframing the sage narrative within a different theological framework. The beings are the same, only the interpretation differs. Why was hybridization forbidden? The texts suggest that the mixing created beings who threatened the established order. The children of Apkallu and humans were neither one thing nor the other. They possessed capabilities beyond ordinary humans, but were not bound by the restrictions that governed the sages themselves. They were a third category, a new variable in an equation that was supposed to remain fixed. To the divine hierarchy, particularly to Enlil, who valued order above all else, this represented contamination. The offspring of these unions appear in multiple traditions under various names. The Nephilim of Hebrew scripture, the Rephaim, the shades of the giants, the heroes of Greek mythology who were born of unions between gods and mortals, the demigods whose strength and abilities exceeded human norms. All of these may be cultural memories of the same phenomenon, a hybrid population that emerged from the mixing of sage and human lineages. Their very existence demonstrated that the boundary between creator and created could be crossed, and that thought was intolerable to those who maintained that boundary. The texts suggest that the hybridization accelerated over time. What began as occasional mixing became more systematic, perhaps even intentional. Some interpretations propose that the later sages were deliberately creating a hybrid population, a new kind of being that could serve as bridge. Others suggest that the mixing was a natural consequence of prolonged contact, inevitable when different kinds of beings live in proximity. Whatever the cause, the result was a growing population of hybrid offspring, whose existence would ultimately trigger catastrophic response. Enlil's reaction to this development was not theological, but practical. He did not condemn the mixing as sinful in any abstract moral sense. He identified it as a problem requiring solution. The workers were becoming too much like the masters. The servants were acquiring capabilities that made them difficult to control. The clear hierarchy between divine and human was blurring into something ambiguous and threatening. From a management perspective, the situation was becoming unacceptable. Contamination had occurred, and contamination required cleansing. The concept of bloodline purity runs through these texts with uncomfortable persistence. The divine realm operated on principles of lineage and hierarchy that hybridization disrupted. The sages themselves may have been acceptable as long as they remained separate, performing their teaching function without genetic mixing. But once their bloodline merged with human bloodline, they had created something that did not fit the established categories. Such anomalies are always dangerous to systems that depend on boundaries. The hybrid children were living violations of cosmic order. We should pause to consider what this means if taken seriously. The antediluvian world, according to these accounts, was populated not just by humans and gods, but by hybrid beings of various degrees. The sages themselves, the children they produced with human partners, perhaps multiple generations of increasingly complex lineages. This was not a simple world of slaves serving masters. It was becoming something more diverse and more difficult to control. The flood, in this light, was not punishment for wickedness, but pruning of a garden that had grown beyond its intended design. The iconography of the Apkallu presents us with a puzzle that has never been satisfactorily solved. In virtually every depiction, across thousands of years and multiple cultures, these beings hold the same two objects, a rounded bucket or situla in one hand, and a cone-shaped object resembling a pine cone in the other. The consistency of this imagery suggests it was recording something specific, something that mattered greatly. What were the bucket and pinecone, and what were the Apkallu doing with them? The bucket, called bandudu in Akkadian, appears to have contained liquid of some kind. The Apkallu are often shown dipping their pine cones into the bucket and then extending them toward trees, toward kings, or toward temple doorways. This appears to be a ritual of blessing or purification. But what liquid would be significant enough to appear in thousands of images across centuries of artistic production? Various proposals have been offered: holy water, sacred oil, blood, or something more exotic entirely. The texts refer to waters of life that could restore and renew. Perhaps the bucket contained such transformative substance. The pine cone, called mulilu, presents even greater mystery. Its shape is unmistakable in the carvings, with overlapping scales radiating outward from a central axis. Some scholars have proposed that it was simply a tool for sprinkling liquid from the bucket, an aspergillum for ritual purification. But this functional explanation seems inadequate for an object that appears so prominently in so many contexts. The pine cone meant something more than a mere implement. It was a symbol of significance. One controversial interpretation connects the pine cone to the pineal gland, the small endocrine organ located deep in the brain. The pineal gland's shape does resemble a pine cone, which is how it received its name. Ancient traditions across multiple cultures associated this gland with spiritual vision, with the capacity to perceive beyond ordinary sensory limitation. The pine cone may have been a symbol for this capacity, representing the faculty of extended perception that the sages possessed and perhaps transmitted to those they taught. This interpretation remains speculative, but intriguing. The pinecone appears in contexts far beyond Mesopotamia. The giant bronze pinecone in the Vatican's Court of the Pina is one of the largest ancient bronze sculptures to survive from Roman times. Pine cones appear atop the staff of Osiris in Egyptian imagery. They decorate sacred sites from ancient Greece to medieval cathedrals. This distribution suggests either remarkable coincidence or deliberate transmission of a symbol whose meaning was preserved across cultures and centuries. The pine cone connected something important, even if that connection has been obscured by time. When we examine the palace reliefs closely, we see that the Apkallu are not simply holding these objects. They are using them in specific ways. They approach sacred trees and extend the pine cone toward branches or fruits. They stand behind seated kings and perform gestures with their implements. They flank doorways and repeat their ritual motions endlessly in carved stone. Whatever they were doing, it required repetition. It required the combination of bucket and pinecone together. And it was important enough to decorate the walls of royal palaces. Some researchers have proposed that the Apkallu were performing a kind of genetic maintenance. The sacred trees they approach might represent lineages, bloodlines that required periodic treatment to remain viable. The kings they stand behind might have been receiving adjustments to their genetic material, keeping them tuned to specifications that allowed them to serve their function. The pinecone in this interpretation becomes a symbol or tool of genetic manipulation, and the bucket contains whatever medium made such manipulation possible. This reading is highly speculative, but fits the pattern of evidence. The theft of the me provides additional context for understanding what the sages carried. The me were the divine decrees that governed civilization, the fundamental codes that made society possible. Sumerian mythology describes how Inanna obtained the me from Enki through intoxication and trickery. But another tradition suggests the Apkallu themselves were involved in transmitting the me from divine to human realms. If the bucket and pinecone were tools for this transmission, they would have been instruments of civilizational transfer, not merely ritual implements. This connects to the broader Prometheus parallel that runs through Apkallu mythology. Like Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods to give to humanity, the sages brought knowledge that was not originally intended for human possession. They were benefactors who violated divine protocols to elevate their charges. The bucket and pinecone may have been the tools of this benefaction, the means by which forbidden knowledge was packaged and delivered. Their prominence in the imagery would then reflect their central importance. We cannot know with certainty what these objects represented. The meanings were likely obvious to ancient observers who understood the context that has been lost to us. But the persistence of the imagery across such vast spans of time and space suggests something more than arbitrary symbolism. The bucket and pinecone encoded knowledge that those who preserved the images considered worth transmitting. That we can no longer read this code fully does not mean the code was meaningless. It means we have lost the key that the ancients possessed. Among all the sages, one stands out. Adapa, also known as Oannes, was the first and greatest of the seven. But his story reveals tensions that would eventually lead to the termination of the entire sage project. Adapa was not merely a teacher. He was a case study in what happens when the boundaries between God and human become too permeable. His error, and Enki's response to it, exposed the deep conflicts that underlay the sage mission. Adapa was a priest of Enki in the ancient city of Eridu, considered the first city in Sumerian tradition. He possessed extraordinary wisdom granted to him by Enki, and served as a model for the sage figure who would appear repeatedly throughout Mesopotamian literature. Unlike later human priests, Adapa had direct access to divine knowledge. He could perform rituals that affected the natural world. He understood the workings of cosmic forces. In every way that mattered, he had crossed the threshold from human limitation into something approaching divine capability. The incident that would define Adapa's story involved the south wind. While Adapa was fishing in the Persian Gulf, the south wind rose and overturned his boat. Adapa, angered by this disruption, spoke words of power that broke the wing of the south wind. For 7 days the wind did not blow. This demonstration of authority over natural forces could not go unnoticed. Adapa had revealed that he possessed power over elements that should have been beyond human reach. He was summoned to heaven to appear before Anu, the king of the gods, to account for his actions. Before Adapa ascended to the heavenly realm, Enki counseled him on how to behave. This counsel reveals the complexity of Enki's position. He advised Adapa to wear mourning clothes and explained that he mourned for 2 gods who had vanished from the land, Dumuzi and Gishida. These same gods would be guarding the gate of heaven, and Adapa's mourning for them would win their favor. They would speak on his behalf before Anu. This advice proved accurate. Dumuzi and Gishida interceded for Adapa, and Anu's anger was softened. But Enki also gave Adapa a second instruction, one that would prove far more consequential. He told Adapa that when he arrived before Anu, he would be offered bread and water. These would be the bread and water of death, Enki warned. Adapa must refuse them, or he would die. This advice, too, Adapa followed. When Anu offered him bread and water, Adapa declined. But here is where the story becomes troubling. The bread and water were not death, they were life. They were the food and drink of immortality. By refusing them, Adapa lost the chance to become truly divine. Why did Enki deceive his favored servant? This question has puzzled scholars for millennia. One interpretation suggests that Enki did not want Adapa to gain full immortality because that would have made him too powerful, uncontrollable even by his patron. Another proposes that Enki wanted to keep Adapa dependent, useful but limited. A third suggests that Enki feared what the other gods would do if a human achieved true immortality. Whatever the motivation, Enki's deception reveals that even the god most sympathetic to humanity maintained limits on how far that sympathy would extend. The story of Adapa demonstrates the fundamental paradox of the Sage Project. The sages were sent to elevate humanity, to transmit knowledge that would transform human capability. But there were limits to this elevation. Certain thresholds were not to be crossed. Humans could become wise, but not immortal. They could possess power, but not sovereignty. They could approach the divine, but not become divine. Adapa reached the very edge of these limits, and was turned back by deception from the one who had raised him to that height in the first place. The incident of the south wind reveals what made Adapa so threatening, and by extension, all the sages and their hybrid offspring so threatening to cosmic order. Adapa spoke words, and nature obeyed. He exercised authority over forces that were supposed to be reserved for divine control. This was not merely impressive, it was dangerous. If humans could command the wind, what else might they command? If the servants could control the elements, what need would they have for masters? The Sage Project had created beings who were becoming too powerful to remain servants. Adapa returned from heaven with immortality denied, but wisdom intact. He continued to serve as sage and priest. But something had been revealed that could not be unrevealed. The divine realm had shown its fear of human potential. Enki had demonstrated that even he would sabotage his own creations to maintain certain boundaries. The relationship between gods and humans was not one of straightforward hierarchy, but of complex management, of careful calibration to ensure that humanity remained useful without becoming threatening. The sages operated within this tension. The story of Adapa foreshadows the flood that would come later. If even the most favored human could not be allowed full divine status, what would happen when hybrid populations began to appear? When beings who combined sage and human nature multiplied upon the earth? When the boundaries that Adapa's story reinforced began to dissolve through biological mixing? The answer would be catastrophic. The limits that Adapa encountered individually would be enforced collectively through water and death. The error of Adapa was not his alone. It was the error of all who sought to rise beyond assigned station. Enlil was not a god who tolerated disorder. Unlike his brother Enki, who delighted in complexity and creative intervention, Enlil valued stability, hierarchy, and clear boundaries. He had never been comfortable with the human experiment. The noise of human civilization disturbed his rest. The proliferation of human population threatened to overwhelm the systems designed to contain them. And the SAGE project, Enki's initiative to accelerate human development, represented exactly the kind of rogue operation that Enlil despised. When the hybridization began, when sage blood mixed with human blood, Enlil began to compile his case. The texts describe humanity's noise as the immediate cause of divine displeasure. But we should understand this noise not as literal sound, but as the signature of activity, of development, of technological and social complexity expanding beyond designed limits. The antediluvian world was not populated by primitive people scratching out bare existence. According to the Sumerian accounts, it was a civilization of remarkable advancement, and that advancement had been engineered by the sages. The noise that bothered Enlil was the hum of a civilization operating at levels it was never meant to reach. Enlil's argument was pragmatic rather than moral. He did not claim that humanity was evil or that the sages had acted from wicked motives. He argued that the situation had become unmanageable. The workers were acquiring capabilities that would make them rivals. The hybrid population represented a new category of being that did not fit the established order. The timeline, as Enlil put it, had been polluted. Unauthorized modifications had been made to a system that was supposed to remain stable. Correction was required. The verdict was extermination, not reform, not modification, but complete cleansing of the surface world. The flood would eliminate the hybrid population that had grown over millennia of sage-human mixing. It would destroy the physical infrastructure of antediluvian civilization, the cities and temples and technologies that encoded sage teaching. It would reset Earth to an earlier state, clearing the contamination and allowing a fresh start under stricter controls. This was not punishment, but pest control, the elimination of a problem that had grown beyond acceptable parameters. Why water? The choice of weapon was not arbitrary. The sages had emerged from the Abzu, from the watery deep. They were creatures of water in their origin, and water would be the instrument of their project's termination. But the sages themselves were not primarily targeted by the flood. They were beings who could survive in water, who could return to the deep. The targets were their hybrid offspring, the land-dwelling children of sage and human unions. These could not survive the inundation. They would drown while their pure-blooded sage parents watched from the safety of the Abzu. The Era Epic, a Mesopotamian text that describes divine violence, provides specific language about the sage banishment. The god declares, "I sent them down to the Apsu. I ordered them not to come up." This was not destruction, but exile. The pure sages were not killed. They were recalled to their place of origin and forbidden from returning to the surface world. The instruction they had provided was to cease. The direct contact between Abzu beings and surface humanity was terminated by divine command. The teachers were sent home and told not to return. The Book of Enoch provides parallel testimony from the Hebrew tradition. The Watchers, who had descended to earth and mated with human women, were bound and cast into valleys of the earth, imprisoned for 70 generations until a final day of judgment. The language differs from the Mesopotamian accounts, but the structure is identical. Divine beings who had crossed boundaries were confined, removed from active participation in surface world events. Their hybrid offspring were destroyed in the flood, while they themselves were imprisoned in a kind of cosmic detention. Enki's position during this decision was complicated. The sages were his project, his agents, his contribution to human development. But Enki was also bound by council decisions once they were made. His solution was characteristic of his nature. He found a loophole. He could not directly warn humanity of the coming flood, but he could speak to a wall, and if a human happened to be on the other side of that wall and overheard what was said, that was not technically a violation. Through this stratagem, he warned Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian Noah, to build a vessel and preserve life through the deluge. The flood came as promised. Waters rose from below and fell from above. The world that the sages had built was unmade. Cities that had stood for millennia vanished beneath the waves. The hybrid population drowned, their bodies scattered across a drowned world. The technologies they had used, the libraries they had compiled, the institutions they had established, all of it was erased. When the waters finally receded, the world that emerged was not the world that had existed before. The termination order had been executed. The reset was complete. But was it complete? Some traditions suggest that the extermination was not total. The sages themselves survived in the Abzu, confined but not destroyed. Some hybrid bloodlines may have survived through Utnapishtim and his family, genetic material preserved through the catastrophe. The knowledge itself, though fragmented, was not entirely lost. Survivors retained partial memories of what had been. The flood accomplished much of what Enlil intended, but it did not achieve total elimination. Traces remained that would surface in various forms throughout subsequent history. The termination order raises disturbing questions about the nature of divine authority. If the gods could decide to exterminate a world because it had developed beyond their comfort level, what did that say about their relationship with their creations? Was humanity a project to be managed and pruned as needed? Were we experiments that could be terminated if we failed to meet specifications? The flood mythology across cultures carries this dark implication that our existence is conditional, that powers above reserve the right to end us if we become inconvenient. The sage termination was the first exercise of this reserved right. The 7 motif appears again in the flood chronology. 7 days of warning before the rains began. 7 days of the most intense deluge. The number that defined the sages defined their ending as well. Whatever significance 7 carried in the cosmic order, it framed both the teaching mission and its termination. The same pattern that had organized the transmission of knowledge organized the withdrawal of the teachers and the destruction of their students. The 7-fold structure persisted even as everything else was swept away. When the waters receded and Utnapishtim's vessel came to rest on the mountaintop, a new age began. But this new age was diminished from what had come before. The pure sages were gone, banished to the Abzu with orders not to return. The hybrid population was drowned, their genetic lineage terminated. What remained was a remnant of humanity. Survivors who carried fragmentary memories of the antediluvian world, but had lost direct access to the sources of its wisdom. The Golden Age had ended. The Silver Age, lesser in every way, had begun. The distinction the Mesopotamians drew between Apkallu and Umanu captures this decline precisely. The Apkallu were the sages themselves, beings of non-human or hybrid origin who possessed knowledge directly, who could transmit it from their own understanding. The Umanu were scholars, humans who studied the texts the sages had left behind, who copied tablets without fully understanding them, who performed rituals whose original meaning had been lost. This was not a difference of degree, but of kind. The Apkallu knew, the Umanu merely preserved. The Sumerian king list records this transition with numerical precision. The antediluvian kings ruled for tens of thousands of years each, their reigns measured in impossible spans that suggest either radically different timekeeping or radically different biology. After the flood, reign lengths dropped dramatically. The first post-flood kings still rule for centuries, but the numbers decline with each generation. By historical times, reign lengths have become normal human spans. Whatever had sustained antediluvian longevity was no longer available. The upgrade had been rolled back. The tablets of destiny, the me that had governed civilization, were confiscated and redistributed under new management. Marduk, the rising god of Babylon, claimed these tablets for himself, using them to establish his supremacy in the post-flood divine order. The direct transmission from sage to student was replaced by mediated access through temple hierarchies and priestly bureaucracies. Knowledge became institutionalized, controlled, gate-kept by those who claimed divine authorization. The open-source wisdom of the sage era became proprietary, accessible only through approved channels. The physical infrastructure of civilization had to be rebuilt from scratch. The cities that had stood before the flood were gone. Their locations, sometimes preserved only in memory, or gradually rediscovered through archaeological investigation. New cities arose, but they were not built to the same specifications. The architectural knowledge that had produced antediluvian monuments was partially lost. Later Mesopotamian ziggurats were impressive, but represented recovery rather than continuation of what had existed before. The builders were working from corrupted files. Religious practice shifted in character as well. The antediluvian relationship between humans and divine beings had been direct, mediated by sages who could move between realms. Post-flood religion became more distant, more ritualized, more dependent on symbols and ceremonies rather than direct contact. The gods retreated to their celestial domains, communicating through omens, dreams, and the interpretations of specialized priests. The intimacy of the sage era was replaced by formal worship of entities who no longer walked among their worshippers. The scribal traditions that preserved Mesopotamian learning explicitly acknowledged this decline. Scholars referred to antediluvian tablets as sources of supreme authority, originals from the time before the flood that carried authenticity later texts could not match. When they discovered, or claimed to discover, such tablets, they treated them as treasures beyond price. The reverence reflects awareness that something had been lost, that the post-flood world was operating on copies of what the sages had originally transmitted. Each generation moved further from the source. Some texts suggest that the Umanu were not simply human scholars, but perhaps carried diluted sage bloodlines, descendants of hybrid lines that had somehow survived the flood. This would explain their special status and their ability to access knowledge beyond ordinary human reach. But if this is true, the bloodline was fading with each generation, the sage inheritance becoming progressively more diluted until it could no longer be distinguished from ordinary human capacity. The genetic legacy, if it existed, was bleeding out across post-flood centuries. The mystery schools that emerged in the post-flood world may have been attempts to preserve or recreate what had been lost. Initiatory traditions that claimed to transmit secret knowledge from teacher to student echoed the sage pattern of direct transmission. The symbolism these schools employed, including serpents, trees, and ascending ladders of knowledge, recalled Apkallu iconography. Whether these schools maintained genuine continuity with antediluvian wisdom or merely imitated forms whose substance had been lost remains debated. Some may have preserved fragments. Others certainly invented traditions they falsely claimed as ancient. The post-flood world was not merely poorer in knowledge, it was structured differently. The antediluvian pattern of sage teachers providing direct instruction to receptive students gave way to hierarchical systems of controlled access. Temples became bureaucracies. Priests became gatekeepers. Knowledge became property to be hoarded rather than gift to be shared. This transformation may have been intentional, part of the new dispensation that Enlil favored over Enki's more generous model. The replacement of Apkallu with Umanu was not merely a change in who taught, but in how teaching was organized and controlled. History is written by the victors, and the victors in the cosmic conflict that culminated in the flood were not the sages or their human allies. Enlil's faction had prevailed. The Sage Project had been terminated. The hybrid population had been eliminated. Now the narrative had to be shaped to justify what had been done and to prevent any future repetition. This required transforming the memory of the sages from benefactors to threats, from teachers to tempters, from civilizers to corrupters. The propaganda war began as soon as the floodwaters receded. In Babylonian tradition, the Apkallu retained much of their positive characterization. They were still depicted as protectors, their images placed in building foundations and at doorways to ward off evil. The reliefs in Assyrian palaces showed them as powerful, but not malevolent, performing their ritual functions with pinecone and bucket. But even in Mesopotamia, tensions appeared. Some texts suggested that the sages had brought knowledge that humans should not possess, that their gifts were double-edged. The ambivalence that would later dominate began as whisper. The Hebrew scriptures completed the transformation. The sons of God, who descended to mate with human women, became fallen angels, rebels against divine authority. Their offspring, the Nephilim, became giants and monsters, heroes of old reinterpreted as villains. The Watchers of Enochic tradition were not wise teachers, but criminals who corrupted humanity, who taught weapons-making and cosmetics and the reading of signs, all of which were reframed as forbidden arts rather than civilizing gifts. The positive sage tradition was inverted into a narrative of cosmic crime. The Book of Enoch provides the most detailed demonization. The Watchers are named and their crimes enumerated. Azazel taught metalworking and weapon-making. Shemhazai led the sexual descent to human women. Others taught astrology and herbcraft, and various forms of knowledge now classified as illicit. God's response is judgment and punishment. The Watchers are bound and imprisoned. Their offspring are destroyed. The flood cleanses the corruption they introduced. The entire narrative frames the sage transmission as violation rather than gift, as contamination rather than elevation. This inversion served multiple purposes for those who promoted it. It explained the flood as moral response to genuine evil rather than administrative decision to prune overgrown population. It delegitimized knowledge that threatened religious authority by associating it with demonic sources. It created a framework in which seeking hidden wisdom became spiritually dangerous, an invitation to corruption rather than an impulse toward growth. The demonization of the sages was simultaneously justification, warning, and control mechanism. The fish-being imagery of the sages underwent its own transformation. Oannes, emerging from the Persian Gulf, became Dagon, the fish god of the Philistines, enemy of Israel. The fish imagery that had represented wisdom from the deep became associated with pagan religion, with the enemies of the one true God. Centuries later, some would note that the Pope's mitre bears resemblance to a fish head, suggesting that the imagery had been adopted even by those who officially condemned its source. Symbols persist even when their meanings are inverted. The giant traditions demonstrate how thoroughly the transformation succeeded. The Nephilim, Rephaim, and various giant races that appear throughout Hebrew scripture are uniformly negative. They are enemies to be defeated, abominations to be destroyed, remnants of a corruption that must be cleansed. The Israelites are commanded to eliminate them entirely, sparing no survivors. This total war against giant populations reads differently when we understand them as descendants of sage-human unions. The biblical conquest becomes continuation of the flood's termination order. By other means, Mesopotamian traditions themselves were suppressed as the Abrahamic religions spread. The cuneiform tablets that preserved Apkallu accounts were buried and forgotten for millennia. The ziggurats that had honored the sages fell into ruin. The scribal traditions that had maintained the knowledge were discontinued. When archaeologists began recovering these texts in the 19th century, they revealed a version of familiar stories that predated and often contradicted the biblical versions. The sage tradition had been not merely demonized, but erased, its very existence hidden until modern discovery. The effectiveness of this demonization shapes perception to this day. Ask most people about beings who descended from heaven to mate with humans and teach forbidden knowledge, and they will describe fallen angels, evil spirits, corruptors of humanity. Few will describe teachers, civilizers, beings who sacrificed their own status to elevate the creatures they came to serve. The dominant narrative has become so thoroughly established that alternative readings seem absurd or dangerous. The propaganda war was won so completely that most people do not know there was ever another interpretation. We should be careful about what this demonization accomplished. By making the sages into villains, the powers that controlled religious narrative could dismiss any wisdom attributed to them as tainted. Claims of ancient knowledge became suspect. Traditions that preserved alternative interpretations became heresies. The possibility that humanity had once received genuine gifts from non-human benefactors was ruled out by definition. What we lost was not merely historical accuracy, but openness to an entire category of experience that the demonization was designed to foreclose. The pinecone that the Apkallu carried has left a trail across civilizations that demands explanation. This modest botanical form appears in sacred contexts throughout the ancient world and persists into modern religious architecture in ways that suggest deliberate transmission rather than coincidence. Following this trail takes us from the palaces of Assyria to the temples of Greece, from Egyptian iconography to the heart of Vatican City. Wherever the pinecone appears, it seems to mark something important, something connected to the wisdom tradition the sages initiated. In Mesopotamia, the pinecone's association with the Apkallu was explicit and consistent. It appeared in their hands in countless depictions. It was directed toward sacred trees and toward kings. It featured in rituals whose precise nature we can only infer from visual evidence. The Mesopotamians clearly considered this object significant enough to reproduce it obsessively in their art. Whatever the pinecone meant to them, it was not casual symbolism. It was central to understanding what the Apkallu did and why it mattered. Greek religion adopted pinecone imagery in its worship of Dionysus. The thyrsus, the sacred staff carried by Dionysus and his followers, was topped with a pinecone. This staff represented ecstatic knowledge, the wisdom that comes through transcendence of ordinary consciousness. The pinecone at its apex symbolized the culmination of the mystic journey, the opening of perception that allowed access to truth beyond rational comprehension. This use parallels the Mesopotamian association of pinecones with elevated wisdom, suggesting transmission of meaning, if not direct cultural contact. The Dionysian mysteries promised initiates access to transformative knowledge through ritual practices that included wine, dance, and the symbolic equipment of the god. The thyrsus was not merely decoration, but instrument of the transformation sought. Its pinecone tip represented the goal, activation of capacities that ordinary life kept dormant. Whether this symbolism derived from Mesopotamian sources or arose independently, it aligned remarkably with what the Apkallu iconography seems to suggest about the function of their pinecone implements. Egyptian traditions show similar patterns. The staff of Osiris, the god of death and rebirth, features what appears to be a pinecone. Osiris presided over the mysteries of transformation, the passage from death to eternal life. His staff symbolized authority over these transitions. That it should incorporate pinecone imagery connects him to the broader Mediterranean tradition of associating this shape with transcendent knowledge and capacity. The Osirian mysteries, like the Dionysian, promised initiates access to wisdom beyond the grave. The trail leads eventually to Rome and to its successor, the Vatican. The Court of the Pina at the Vatican takes its name from an enormous bronze pinecone that once served as a fountain in ancient Rome. This pinecone, taller than a man, now stands in a courtyard at the heart of the Catholic Church's administrative center. Its presence there raises questions that official sources do not satisfactorily answer. Why does the Vatican prominently display a symbol associated with pagan wisdom, and, through them, with the Apkallu of ancient Mesopotamia? The papal staff historically incorporated pinecone motifs as well. The symbolism persists in architectural details throughout Vatican City. Whatever explanations are offered, the visual fact remains that an institution that officially condemns pagan religion has placed pagan symbols at the center of its sacred space. This could represent appropriation, the deliberate adoption of powerful symbols from conquered traditions. It could represent continuity, the preservation of meaning through institutional transfer. It could represent something else entirely that official history does not acknowledge. The pineal gland connection, though speculative, deserves serious consideration. This small organ deep in the brain was called pineal precisely because its shape resembles a pine cone. Ancient traditions across cultures associated the pineal region with spiritual vision, with the third eye that perceives what ordinary eyes cannot. If the Apkallu pinecone symbolized this capacity, then the trail we have followed connects physical neurology with mythological symbolism, suggesting that the ancients understood something about consciousness that modern science is only beginning to explore. The consistency of the pinecone across cultures and centuries suggests more than independent invention. Symbols do not usually maintain such precise associations across unrelated contexts without some mechanism of transmission. Trade routes could have carried the imagery. Migrating populations could have transported their sacred symbols. Mystery traditions could have preserved meanings that public religion forgot. Some combination of these factors may explain how a symbol associated with beings who emerged from the Persian Gulf ended up adorning the staff of Greek gods and the courtyard of the Roman Pope. What the pinecone ultimately represents may be the capacity that the sages transmitted to humanity, the ability to perceive and understand beyond ordinary limitation, if their gift was not merely information, but transformation of consciousness itself. The pinecone would symbolize this transformed state. Those who received the transmission would possess what the symbol represented. Those who merely saw the symbol without understanding would treat it as decoration, as religious motif, as cultural artifact. The meaning would hide in plain sight, visible to initiates, invisible to everyone else. 7 sages. This number was not arbitrary. Throughout the ancient world, 7 carried significance that modern rationality has difficulty explaining. 7 visible planets wandering against the fixed stars. 7 days in the week derived from those planets. 7 notes in the musical scale. 7 chakras in the yogic system. 7 heavens in various cosmologies. The number appears with suspicious frequency wherever ancient peoples attempted to describe the structure of reality. The sages fit this pattern, embodying a number that seemed to encode something fundamental about how existence was organized. The Mesopotamian astronomical system was built around 7. The 7 wandering bodies, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, determined the days of the week that we still use today. Each day was assigned to one of these celestial powers, a system that has persisted for over 4,000 years across cultural and religious transformations. That there were 7 sages teaching under 7 antediluvian kings suggests intentional alignment between terrestrial instruction and celestial order. The sages were not merely teaching content, but demonstrating cosmic correspondence. The musical scale's 7 notes create the framework within which all melodic and harmonic development occurs. This is not arbitrary convention, but mathematical relationship, the division of octave into intervals that produce consonance and meaningful progression. The ancients understood music as cosmic principle, the harmony of the spheres reflecting an audible vibration. What existed in celestial arrangement? If the sages taught music, they taught a 7-fold structure that mirrored the 7-fold pattern of the wandering stars. Again, the number connects domains that seem separate. The yogic system identifies 7 chakras, energy centers arranged along the spine through which life force flows. This system developed in South Asia, apparently independent of Mesopotamian influence, yet it employs the same fundamental number. Either the number 7 carries significance that human consciousness discovers independently across cultures, or transmission occurred through channels we have not identified. The chakra system promises that proper development activates these centers sequentially, culminating in transcendent awareness. The sages may have taught analogous systems. Biblical tradition shows the 7 pattern repeatedly. 7 days of creation, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls in the book of Revelation, 7 churches addressed in the opening chapters of that text. The Jewish menorah, with its 7 branches. The Sabbath as the 7th day. This is not merely Mesopotamian borrowing, but absorption of a pattern considered cosmically significant. The Hebrew tradition, even while demonizing the Watchers, preserved the numerical framework within which they had operated. The number survived the theological transformation. The 7 wonders of the ancient world suggest awareness that certain achievements deserved to be grouped in this specific number. Whether the list was arbitrary or reflected genuine recognition that 7 was the appropriate quantity for such enumeration, the pattern persisted. The 7 hills of Rome, the 7 sages of Greece, the 7 liberal arts of medieval education, all continue the pattern into eras far removed from Mesopotamian direct influence. The number had become embedded in how human civilization organized significant categories. What does 7 actually encode? Various explanations have been proposed. The number may represent completion or perfection, the filling of a structural pattern. It may reflect astronomical observation embedded in culture so deeply that it persists without conscious recognition of its origin. It may carry numerical properties that make it naturally significant for certain kinds of organization. Or it may represent something else entirely, a pattern transmitted from the sages themselves as part of the knowledge they delivered. We use their number without understanding why. The fact that there were specifically 7 sages suggests intentional design rather than coincidence. If these were genuine beings who came to teach humanity, they organized themselves according to a number they considered cosmically significant. If they were mythological projections, the mythmakers chose this number for reasons that must have seemed compelling. Either way, the 7-fold pattern was not random. It was deliberate expression of something the ancients understood about how reality structured itself, and how instruction should proceed in alignment with that structure. Modern culture has largely forgotten the significance of 7, while continuing to organize around it. We live in a 7-day week without thinking about why. We recognize 7 colors in the rainbow, though the spectrum is continuous and any division is somewhat arbitrary. We tell stories with 7 dwarfs, 7 samurai, 7 deadly sins. The pattern persists in popular culture as echo of something once understood more deeply. The sages taught in 7-fold structure, and we continue to think in 7-fold structure without recognizing the connection. The termination of the sages was itself framed in 7. 7 days of warning, 7 days of deluge. The number that organized their teaching, organized their ending. Whatever cosmic significance 7 carried, it applied to both transmission and withdrawal. The pattern was not merely cultural preference, but something woven into the fabric of how these events unfolded. The 7 sages began in 7, taught in 7, and ended in 7. The number was their signature, their structure, and ultimately their epitaph. The question that haunts the sage narrative is ultimately biological. If these beings truly mated with human women and produced hybrid offspring, what happened to that genetic material? The flood narrative suggests total elimination, but genetics does not work with such clean breaks. If any hybrid lineages survived, diluted traces might persist in human populations to this day. The Bloodline Question connects ancient mythology to modern science in ways that remain largely unexplored by mainstream research, but fascinating to those willing to consider the implications. The survival of Utnapishtim and his family presents an obvious vector for genetic continuation. If Utnapishtim himself carried sage genetic material, or if any of his family members did, the flood would not have achieved total elimination. The Sumerian king list identified Utnapishtim as having connections to the antediluvian order that survived into the post-flood period. His exceptional status, his selection for survival, his subsequent immortalization, all suggest that something about him was not ordinary. That something could have been partially non-human ancestry. The exceptional lifespans recorded for post-flood patriarchs might reflect diminishing sage inheritance. Noah lives 950 years according to Genesis. His son Shem lives 600 years. Subsequent generations show progressively shorter spans until by the time of David, lifespans have normalized to modern human ranges. This pattern matches what we would expect from a diluting genetic inheritance, each generation carrying less of whatever factor enabled antediluvian longevity. The exceptional lifespans were not miracles, but biology, and the biology was running out. The giant traditions may preserve memory of populations in which sage genetics remained concentrated. The Nephilim, Rephaim, and various giant races appear throughout ancient Mediterranean traditions. They are consistently described as larger, stronger, and often more intelligent than ordinary humans. If these populations descended from sage-human unions, their distinctive characteristics would reflect their genetic inheritance. Their gradual elimination through warfare, intermarriage, and deliberate extermination would represent the final phase of the Termination Order's execution. Modern genetics has revealed that human populations carry DNA from non-Homo sapiens sources. Neanderthal and Denisovan genetic contributions appear in modern human genomes, demonstrating that our species has a history of interbreeding with other human-like populations. This establishes precedent for what the sage narrative describes: genetic mixing between humans and a different kind of being. The scientific finding does not prove the sage story, but removes one objection to it. We know that such mixing occurred with some populations. The question is whether it occurred with others. Anomalous genetic markers in certain populations have attracted attention from those who take the sage narrative seriously. Blood type distributions, unusual genetic variants, claims of distinctive physiological traits, all of these have been proposed as possible traces of non-ordinary ancestry. The evidence remains controversial and largely unexamined by mainstream genetics, which has little interest in hypotheses it considers mythological. Whether anything would be found if serious investigation were conducted remains unknown. The question has not been asked in ways that would produce answers. The royal bloodline obsession that runs through ancient history may reflect awareness of genetic distinctiveness worth preserving. Royal families throughout the ancient world traced their ancestry to divine or semi-divine origins. They maintained strict endogamy, marrying within restricted circles to preserve whatever made their blood special. This behavior makes little sense if divine ancestry was mere propaganda, but makes perfect sense if it reflected biological reality. The kings were keeping their sage inheritance from diluting by restricting who could contribute to their lineage. The bucket and pinecone ritual that Apkallu performed with kings may have been genetic maintenance. Procedures designed to preserve or enhance whatever made royal bloodlines distinctive. If the sages possessed biotechnology, as some interpretations suggest, they could have provided ongoing support for the lineages they had created. When the sages were banished, this maintenance ceased. The royal bloodlines would have begun to degrade, their special characteristics fading with each generation. The post-flood world saw the slow unwinding of what the sages had built into selected human lineages. The modern fascination with DNA and ancestry connects unexpectedly to these ancient concerns. Millions of people now submit samples for genetic testing, seeking to understand their origins and connections. This impulse to know one's bloodline echoes the ancient obsession with lineage that the sage narrative embodies. We sense that our genetics encode something important, something about who we are and where we came from. The ancients believed this more explicitly than we do, but the underlying intuition persists. We are our blood, and our blood carries secrets. What would it mean if sage genetics survived in modern populations? If certain people carry diluted traces of non-human ancestry? The implications would be profound, but also controversial. Claims of special bloodlines have been used to justify terrible things throughout history. Yet the question remains legitimate, regardless of how its answers might be misused. The sage narrative asserts that humanity was upgraded through genetic mixing with more advanced beings. Whether this occurred and whether traces remain are questions that deserve investigation rather than dismissal. There is another way to read the sage narrative. That strips away religious language and reveals a structure uncomfortably familiar to modern observers. Imagine the divine hierarchy not as supernatural beings, but as an advanced civilization managing a project. Enlil is not a storm god, but a chief executive concerned with control and efficiency. Enki is not a trickster deity, but a research director pursuing unauthorized experiments. The sages are not mystical beings, but field operatives. And the flood is not divine punishment, but corporate restructuring. This reading makes the ancient texts feel disturbingly contemporary. From this perspective, humanity was a project, a workforce created to serve the needs of those who made us. The texts explicitly state that humans were created to bear the burden of work so the gods could rest. This is employment, labor extraction, the creation of a servant class. The sages were training personnel, installing the software that would make the workers effective. Their mission was to develop human capacity to the level required for useful service. This was not generosity, but investment in productive capacity. The hybridization that triggered the termination order looks different through this lens. Workers were not supposed to become too similar to management. Genetic mixing blurred lines that organizational hierarchy required to remain clear. If your workforce starts developing management capabilities, starts questioning instructions, starts innovating beyond approved parameters, you have a problem. The hybrid population represented exactly this kind of organizational boundary violation. They were neither worker nor management, but something disruptive between. Enlil's response was corporate crisis management. The project had gone off specification. Unauthorized modifications had been made. The solution was to reset to an earlier version, eliminating the problematic developments and restarting under tighter controls. The flood was not anger, but efficiency, the termination of a failed experiment, and the conservation of resources for a fresh approach. Enlil compiled his dossier, presented his case, obtained approval, and executed the restructuring. The language of myth obscures what might have been bureaucratic process. The noise that disturbed Enlil translates easily into organizational terms. Noise is unsanctioned activity, developments that were not approved, expansion beyond designated parameters. When a project team starts doing things beyond their mandate, management gets concerned. The industrial hum of unauthorized technology that some interpretations identify as the noise reflects a workforce that was exceeding specifications, using capabilities they were not supposed to have, building things they were not supposed to build. The noise was the sound of workers outgrowing their designated role. Inky's position as sympathetic manager adds another corporate dimension. He initiated the enhancement project against organizational resistance. When it was terminated, he found a loophole to preserve his work, warning Utnapishtim through technicality rather than direct instruction. This is the behavior of a researcher who has invested heavily in a project and cannot bear to see it completely destroyed. He saves what he can through procedural maneuvering, maintaining plausible deniability while ensuring some continuity of his investment. The post-flood reorganization follows corporate restructuring patterns. The original field agents, the sages, were removed from the operation. They were replaced with lower-grade personnel, the Umanu, who followed procedures without understanding their purpose. Knowledge was institutionalized and controlled through proper channels. Direct access to decision-makers was replaced by hierarchical mediation. The organic, improvisational approach of the Sage era gave way to bureaucratic management by the book. Innovation was suppressed in favor of stability. The confiscation of the Tablets of Destiny represents intellectual property consolidation. The operational codes that govern civilization were gathered under central control. What had been distributed through sage transmission became proprietary information held by authorized parties. Access required credentials. Distribution was controlled. The open-source model of antediluvian knowledge transfer was replaced by closed systems that maintained organizational power. This transformation has repeated throughout human history, whenever centralized powers have consolidated control over information. The demonization of the sages reads as corporate reputation management. The terminated project could not be allowed to remain positively remembered. Those who had been eliminated had to be recast as threats rather than assets, criminals rather than benefactors. The propaganda that transformed wisdom teachers into corrupting demons served the same function as modern corporate messaging after controversial decisions. The narrative was shaped to support the actions taken and to prevent sympathy for those who had been removed. This interpretation does not require literal belief in ancient extraterrestrials managing human affairs. It requires only recognition that organizational dynamics are not unique to modern corporations. Power structures, hierarchical control, information management, workforce development, crisis response. All of these patterns recur wherever complex organizations operate. The ancient myths may have encoded real events whose participants and contexts we cannot recover. Or they may have encoded universal patterns of organizational behavior projected onto cosmic scale. Either way, the resonance with modern corporate experience is striking. The 7 sages emerged from the water to teach humanity before retreating to the depths. This narrative finds unexpected echo in modern phenomena that mainstream science struggles to explain. Unidentified anomalous phenomena, formerly called UFOs, have been observed entering and exiting bodies of water with increasing frequency and documentation. Navy pilots describe objects that move between air and water without apparent difficulty. Sonar operators detect fast-moving submerged objects that defy identification. The tic-tac phenomenon, named for the shape of objects observed, demonstrates capabilities beyond current human technology. The connection to sage mythology is not lost on those who study both traditions. Beings that emerge from water demonstrate advanced capability, interact with humanity, and return to the depths describe both the ancient Apkallu and the modern transmedium phenomena. Whether these connections are meaningful or coincidental remains debated. But the structural parallels are difficult to ignore. Something has been associated with our oceans that seems to exceed ordinary explanation in antiquity and in the present day. The Abzu, Enki's domain, was explicitly described as an underground freshwater ocean, a vast aquifer system beneath the surface of the earth. The sages emerged from this realm and returned to it when their mission concluded or was terminated. If they did not die, but merely withdrew, where would they be? Beneath the waters, in realms that surface humanity cannot easily access. The world's oceans cover 70% of the planet's surface and remain largely unexplored. What might exist in those depths that we have not discovered? The banishment order specified that the sages were not to come up. This implies they continued to exist, but in a confined state, restricted from surface contact but not eliminated. The Book of Enoch specifies imprisonment for 70 generations, a finite term with an expiration date. If these accounts reflect actual events, the question of whether that sentence has been served becomes relevant. Have the conditions of confinement been fulfilled? Is the period of restriction ending? Such questions seem absurd until one notices the increasing frequency of anomalous phenomena in recent decades. The timing of humanity's technological development may be relevant to these speculations. We have reached a point where we can detect things we could not detect before. Radar, sonar, infrared sensors, satellite imagery, all of these technologies expand what we can perceive. If something has been present all along, but beyond our detection capabilities, we might only now be developing the instruments to notice it. The sages, if they persist, might not have become more active, but merely more visible as our perception has expanded. Government disclosure of UAP information has accelerated in recent years. What was once dismissed and ridiculed is now subject of congressional hearings and official investigation. Multiple nations have released previously classified files. Military personnel have testified publicly about encounters that defy conventional explanation. This shift in official posture does not prove the sage connection, but creates space for questions that would have seemed illegitimate a generation ago. Something is happening that authorities can no longer entirely deny. The deep-sea exploration programs of recent decades have revealed life forms and environments that challenge previous assumptions about what is possible in extreme conditions. Creatures thrive in crushing pressures, in volcanic vents, in absolute darkness. The biosphere extends far beyond what surface observation suggested. If the Abzu was a realm of advanced beings, they would not require surface conditions to exist. The deep could support forms of life and activity that surface-dwelling humans have difficulty imagining. The increase in ocean monitoring has produced data anomalies that official sources rarely discuss publicly. Unexplained acoustic signatures, objects moving at speeds that no known submarine technology can achieve, detection events that do not match any identified military or civilian activity. Whether these anomalies connect to ancient sage traditions or represent something entirely different, they indicate that the oceans contain more than we understand. The deep remains mysterious despite our technology, perhaps because of what that mystery contains. Some have proposed that the modern UFO phenomenon represents the sages or their successors, making renewed contact, testing human response, preparing for a return that ancient prophecies anticipated. This interpretation cannot be proven, but cannot be easily dismissed by those who take both the ancient accounts and the modern phenomena seriously. If beings were banished for a fixed term, and that term is expiring, and phenomena consistent with their presence are increasing, the convergence demands attention, even if it does not permit conclusions. We live in an age when ancient categories and modern observations may be converging in unexpected ways. The sages who taught humanity and were banished to the deep may have left traces in our mythology, our genetics, our symbols, and perhaps in the anomalous phenomena that our instruments increasingly detect. Whether we will recognize a return, if it occurs, and how we will respond if we do, remains to be seen. The ghost in the deep may not have departed. It may only have been waiting for conditions that allow it to surface again. The tablets of destiny were not merely metaphorical. They were described as physical objects containing the fundamental codes that govern civilization and reality itself. Whoever possessed these tablets controlled the ordering of the cosmos, the division of powers, the allocation of fates. The sages were instrumental in transmitting the contents of these tablets to humanity, teaching the mathematical, astronomical, and organizational systems that made complex society possible. When the Sage Project was terminated, the tablets were confiscated and redistributed under new management. Sumerian mythology describes multiple episodes involving the theft or transfer of the tablets of destiny. In one account, the bird god Abzu steals the tablets from Enlil, creating cosmic chaos until they are recovered. In another, Marduk claims the tablets after defeating Tiamat, using their authority to reorganize the pantheon under his leadership. These narratives encode power struggles over who controls the fundamental codes of civilization. The tablets were not mere symbols. They were operating systems, and whoever held them could reprogram reality itself. The me, the related concept of divine decrees that governed all aspects of civilization, number over 100. In the most complete listings, they include kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, the art of the hero, the art of power, the art of treachery, and dozens of other fundamental categories. The sages were transmitters of these me, installing them in human civilization. Through their teaching, when they were banished, the direct transmission ceased. Humans retained the me they had received, but could no longer access the source for updates or clarification. The parallel to modern information technology is unmistakable. The tablets of destiny function like a cosmic operating system. The me-like individual programs or applications. The sages served as installation technicians, configuring human society to run the divine software. When the technicians were removed, the system continued to operate, but could no longer be properly maintained. Bugs accumulated, corruptions crept in. The clean code of antediluvian civilization degraded into the fragmentary and contradictory traditions of the post-flood world. Marduk's seizure of the tablets during the Babylonian period represents a significant reorganization of cosmic authority. The earlier distribution of powers gave way to centralized control under Babylon's patron deity. This theological shift reflected and legitimized political changes on the ground as Babylon rose to dominate Mesopotamia. But it also represented a further distancing of the tablets from their original handlers. The sages had transmitted directly from the source. Marduk claimed the source itself, inserting himself as gatekeeper. The contents of the tablets of destiny remain mysterious, despite extensive textual evidence. They clearly contained more than simple laws or administrative codes. They governed the movements of celestial bodies, the flow of time, the assignment of fates to individuals and nations. They encoded something fundamental about how reality operates. Modern interpreters have proposed various explanations: astronomical tables, genetic codes, mathematical constants, or something that our conceptual vocabulary cannot yet accommodate. The tablets contained what the sages knew and what we have lost. The fragmentation of this knowledge after the flood explains the peculiar character of post-flood religious traditions. Priests performed rituals whose original purposes had been forgotten. Scribes copied tablets they did not fully understand. Societies maintained practices whose functional basis had been lost. The comprehensive system that the sages had transmitted became a collection of isolated fragments, each preserving a piece of the original whole, but none retaining the complete picture. We have been trying to reassemble that picture ever since. The search for the Tablets of Destiny has continued throughout history under various names: the Philosopher's Stone, the Holy Grail, the Book of Thoth, the Emerald Tablet. All of these may represent attempts to recover or rediscover the original encoding that the sages brought. The assumption underlying these quests is that the fundamental knowledge still exists somewhere, hidden or encoded, waiting to be found by those with the wisdom to recognize it. Whether such recovery is possible, whether the original transmission can be restored, remains the great question of esoteric tradition. Some interpretations of sage activity focus on the concept of frequency. The rituals depicted in palace reliefs, with their repetitive gestures and specific implements, may have involved frequency manipulation rather than purely symbolic meaning. The Pinecone directed toward the king may have been transmitting or adjusting vibrational patterns. The bucket may have contained a medium that facilitated frequency transfer. This interpretation places the sage mission in the context of resonance, harmonics, and the tuning of biological systems to cosmic patterns. Ancient Mesopotamian mathematics was built around base 60, a system that modern scholars call sexagesimal. This system produces our 60-second minutes and 360-degree circles. But why 60? The number has unusual properties that make it excellent for harmonic calculations and for expressing ratios that appear in natural phenomena. If the sages were teaching frequency manipulation, base 60 would have been a logical choice for encoding their knowledge. Our inherited mathematical system may preserve sage understanding of cosmic harmonics. The concept of the harmony of the spheres, which appeared in Greek philosophy and persisted through medieval cosmology, proposes that celestial bodies produce tones through their motions, creating a cosmic music that structures reality. This concept may derive from sage teaching transmitted through multiple cultural intermediaries. If the planets produce frequencies, and if those frequencies affect earthly events, then understanding and working with these frequencies would be fundamental knowledge. The sages may have taught not just astronomy, but acoustic cosmology. The king's role in Mesopotamian society included maintaining cosmic order, ensuring that earthly activities harmonized with celestial patterns. The rituals performed for kings were not merely ceremonial, but functional, keeping the royal person tuned to frequencies that allowed effective governance. The sages who stood behind kings in the palace reliefs were not servants, but technicians, maintaining the frequency alignment that allowed the king to serve as interface between divine and human realms. Remove the technicians, and the interface degrades. Modern science has begun to explore how frequencies affect biological systems. Ultrasound can heal or destroy, depending on application. Specific frequencies influence cell behavior, brain activity, and emotional states. Plants respond to sound. Water structures itself differently under different acoustic conditions. These discoveries suggest that ancient traditions associating specific sounds, tones, and vibrations with spiritual or practical effects may have reflected genuine understanding. The sages may have possessed frequency knowledge that modern science is only beginning to recover. The sacred architecture of ancient civilizations incorporated acoustic properties that we are only now beginning to appreciate. Temples and chambers produce specific resonances. Stone circles amplify certain frequencies. The placement and proportion of structures follow patterns that affect how sound behaves within them. If the sages taught sacred geometry and architecture, they may have been teaching acoustic engineering, the design of spaces that would produce or amplify beneficial frequencies. Their structures were instruments as much as buildings. The degradation of knowledge after the flood may have involved loss of frequency understanding. The structures remained, but the knowledge of how to use them was lost. The rituals were performed, but without the precise frequency components that made them effective. Over generations, ceremonies became symbolic rather than functional, their original technical purpose forgotten. We inherited the forms without the function, the instruments without the instruction manual. The frequency dimension of sage knowledge may be what was most thoroughly lost. If the sages return, frequency knowledge might be what they restore. The modern world has developed technologies that manipulate frequencies in various ways, but without the comprehensive understanding that would make such manipulation beneficial. We have power tools without wisdom. The sage teaching may have included not just how to manipulate frequencies, but which frequencies to use and which to avoid, the ethics of acoustic intervention. This knowledge would be relevant in an age of electromagnetic saturation that the ancients could not have imagined. The Book of Enoch specifies that the Watchers were bound for 70 generations. This is not a vague term, but a precise duration. If we calculate 70 generations, using ancient lifespans as measure, or using any reasonable definition of a generation, we arrive at dates that have either passed or are approaching. The question of when the sentence expires has exercised interpreters for centuries. If the imprisonment was real and the term was finite, the sages may no longer be bound by the original restrictions. The waiting may be over. Throughout history, there have been periods when esoteric knowledge seemed to surge into accessibility. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the 19th century occult revival, the current age of recovered ancient texts, and open information. All of these represent moments when hidden wisdom became more available. These surges could reflect the efforts of human seekers alone, or they could reflect periodic contact with sources that had been restricted but were testing boundaries, preparing for fuller emergence. The modern age of disclosure regarding unidentified phenomena may represent the beginning of something unprecedented. For decades, governments denied and ridiculed reports of anomalous encounters. Now they acknowledge that something real is occurring that they cannot explain. The shift from denial to admission creates space for possibilities that were previously excluded. If the sages, or beings like them, are preparing to emerge, the cultural ground is being prepared to receive them in ways that would not have been possible a generation ago. What would emergence look like? Not necessarily dramatic appearance before the United Nations or landing on the White House lawn. The sages originally worked through teaching, through gradual transmission of knowledge to receptive students. A modern emergence might follow similar patterns. Information appearing in unexpected contexts, capabilities developing in individuals who seem to access knowledge beyond their training, technologies arriving that seem to leap beyond incremental development. The sages taught. If they return, they may simply resume teaching. The deep ocean remains the least explored region of our planet, despite all our technology. We have mapped the surface of Mars more completely than the floors of our own seas. Whatever exists in those depths remains largely unknown to surface humanity. If the Abzu was a real place, a real domain where beings of advanced capability could persist, it would be exactly in these unexplored regions. The sages withdrew to the deep. The deep keeps its secrets. But secrets do not last forever, and the deep is beginning to yield evidence of things we did not expect. As this investigation concludes, we are left not with answers, but with better questions. The seven sages may have been myth, cultural projection, or memory of actual beings. Their termination may have been permanent or temporary. Their bloodline may have been eliminated or may persist in diluted form among modern populations. Their knowledge may have been lost, or may be encoded in traditions that preserve more than their practitioners realize. These questions remain open because the evidence permits multiple interpretations. What seems clear is that something important happened in deep antiquity, something that shaped what humanity became, and that the full story has not yet been told. We have traced the seven sages from their emergence in Mesopotamian tradition, through their demonization in later religious systems, to their possible persistence in modern anomalies. The journey has taken us through tablets inscribed 4,000 years ago, through the corridors of Assyrian palaces, through the pages of Genesis and Enoch, to the sonar screens of modern naval vessels. At each stage, the same pattern recurs. Beings from the water who brought knowledge, produced offspring, threatened hierarchy, and were terminated or banished as consequence. The Apkallu were not simple figures. They were teachers who changed what they taught. They were genetic contributors who altered what it meant to be human. They were cosmic criminals who violated boundaries that gods had established. They were victims of bureaucratic decision-making that prioritized order over development. They were perhaps survivors who persist in realms beyond our current access. To reduce them to any single interpretation is to miss the complexity that makes their story resonate across millennia. The legacy of the sages surrounds us, whether we recognize it or not. The 60-second minute and the 360-degree circle derive from their mathematical system. The 7-day week reflects cosmic patterns they understood. The medical symbol of healing serpents connects to their iconography. The Pinecone, decorating religious architecture, traces back to their ritual implements. We live in a world shaped by their teaching, even as we have forgotten who the teachers were. Their presence would not be announced through official channels, but through the accumulating evidence that something beyond our understanding operates in our midst. The demonization that transformed them from benefactors to corruptors served purposes we can now identify. It justified the catastrophe that ended their presence. It delegitimized knowledge that threatened religious authority. It established a framework in which seeking hidden wisdom became spiritually dangerous. The transformation was effective, so effective that the original understanding was nearly lost. Only the recovery of ancient texts in modern times has allowed the alternative narrative to resurface. The genetic question remains open. If the sages mixed their bloodlines with humanity, traces might persist in populations alive today. The exceptional abilities attributed to certain individuals throughout history, the bloodline obsessions of royal families, the claims of special ancestry that various traditions maintain, all of these could reflect awareness, however distorted, of non-ordinary inheritance. We do not know if such inheritance exists, or if we would recognize it if it did. The question has not been adequately investigated. The modern phenomena that echoes sage mythology cannot be easily explained. Objects entering and exiting water, transmedium vehicles that our technology cannot match, increased detection of anomalies in deep ocean environments, government disclosure of previously classified encounters. If the sages were banished to the deep, rather than destroyed, and if the terms of their banishment had temporal limits, we might expect exactly this kind of pattern as those limits approached. We might expect the teachers to begin making themselves known again. What would we do if they returned? The question is not as absurd as it might seem to those who have followed this investigation. If beings who had been confined for millennia began to emerge, if the knowledge they carried remained relevant, if they sought to resume the mission that was interrupted by flood and banishment, how would modern humanity respond? Would we receive them as teachers returning with gifts? Would we fear them as threats to the order we have built? Would our authorities seek to terminate them again? The seven sages may be mythology, cultural projection of human concerns onto cosmic scale. They may be memory, fragmentary recollection of actual events distorted by millennia of retelling. They may be something else entirely that our categories cannot yet accommodate. What seems clear is that this narrative has persisted because it addresses something that humanity continues to need: the possibility that we are not alone, that more advanced beings have taken interest in our development, that the knowledge we possess connects us to sources beyond ordinary human experience. As this investigation concludes, the image that remains is the Apkallu relief in its museum case. The eagle-headed figure, pinecone extended, bucket held ready, wings spread in eternal readiness. The stone eyes that have gazed outward for 27 centuries, watching visitors who do not know what they are seeing. The label says genie, protective spirit, decorative element. But the figure knows what it is. It is a sage, a teacher, a being who came from the deep to elevate humanity and was imprisoned for its gift. And somewhere in the depths, perhaps, it is still waiting. This has been the story of the erased bloodline, the beings who taught humanity and were hunted for their teaching. The Apkallu, the seven sages, the Watchers, the sons of God. Different names for the same figure, different framings of the same narrative. They emerged from water. They gave us civilization. They mixed their blood with ours. They were terminated and banished. And they may not be gone. The ghost in the deep remains. The teachers may yet return. The question is whether we will recognize them when they do.